test. Something to years ago, we met in Palestine.
That's right.
Yes, with Kamal. So I'm very honored. So whenever you want to, we can start.
Should we give
Actually,
it
it's
1
already,
minute? Yeah.
it's already.
But is there a session afterwards? No.
No.
Okay. So what will we give? 1 minute and then we start.
Yeah, after 1 minute. Okay. Sorry? So it's English. I've seen that. Yes. So is it okay to start? We can start. So good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, good afternoon. I'm from UNESCO. My name is Megumi, and welcome to this TED Talk entitled to belong or not to belong. That is the question. Equity, inclusion, pluralism, led by Dr. Jamil Salmi and allow me just to briefly describe Dr. Jamil Salmi's bio. Dr. Salmi is a global tertiary education expert, very extremely famous, actually. We all know when we deal with higher education, actually, providing policy advice to governments, universities all over the world, actually, more than 100 countries around the globe. Dr. Salmi is Emeritus Professor of Higher Education Policy and Diego Portal University in Chile, right now, Research Fellow at Boston College Center for Higher Education. He his latest book on tertiary education and the Sustainable Development Goals was published in August 2017. In 2020, he wrote a report on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education through the equity lens for the Lumina Foundation. So, floor is over. So, thank you very much.
A very good afternoon to all of you. The world of tertiary education has expanded so much since the early days of the first medieval universities in North Africa and Europe. And when we think back of Qarawin in my home country of Morocco, Bologna, Sorbonne, Oxford, and since we are in Spain, let's not forget Salamanca. We have to remember that back then, these universities had only a few dozens, maximum a few hundred students. Today, our planet has 220 million students enrolled in about 20,000 officially recognized tertiary education institutions. Sadly, this impressive and unprecedented expansion has not seen the disappearance of disparities. In fact, if we look at the map of tertiary education enrollment, we can see a sharp contrast between OECD countries reaching 70%, sometimes plus, and African countries. On average for Sub-Saharan Africa, it's only 10%. And the sad irony is that in the future, Africa is going to be the most populated continent, with half of the people being 18 or less. And the statistics I'm sharing, remember, are only national statistics, averages that hide stark disparities within countries. This figure, which was prepared for the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report on Equity, contrasts the tertiary education enrollment rate for the richest income quintile in each country, that's the dots in blue, and the ones in orange red for the poorest income quintile. And you can see on the left for poor countries with low enrollment rate, as well as countries with high enrollment rates on the right, the big difference. Just to give one statistic, Kenya, for children from the richest families, their probability of going to university is 49 times that of the poorest students. But we're not talking about abstract concepts. We're talking about human beings who are denied access to higher education for reasons beyond their own choice. And this impacts on their dignity, and it destroys their hopes, sometimes with catastrophic results. Who remembers in Mexico this 18-year-old girl, Elizabeth Delgado, who a few years back committed suicide because she could not get access to any public university? And that summer, there was a wave of suicides all over Mexico for the same reason. And we don't even know the name of this young female student in Kerala, India, who in June 2020, as she was taking the final exam that would allow her to graduate, all of a sudden the internet fell down and she could never finish. She was so desperate that she took her own life. And who remembers Clennon King? In 1958, this black American student dared to enroll the University of Mississippi, But when he arrived at the registration desk, he was not met with a smile, but with a policeman who arrested him and took him to jail. And he was committed to a mental asylum because the judge felt that surely he would be insane for thinking, imagining that a black student would be allowed into that university. Autherine Lucy Foster, the first African-American student admitted at the University of Alabama. She had to fight her way all the way to the Supreme Court that forced the university to accept her. And the first day when she got to the university, she was met with demonstrations and riots of white students protesting against this horrible event. She had to be escorted away by the police to protect her life. And what did the university do after that? Did they punish the rioters? No. In their wisdom, they decided to suspend her, and a few weeks back, they just expelled her. How could an African-American woman think that she was entitled to study for graduate education? And I would like to think that this is a thing of the past. After all, these events happened more than 60 years ago. But if you read the news about this massacre in a supermarket in Buffalo, where the shooter targeted black Americans, sadly, this is still, we can see that hatred and racism are alive and kicking. Now, so the first reason we have to declare that equity is such a priority is because education is a human right inscribed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You cannot have democracy without social justice. You cannot have social justice without equal opportunities to access tertiary education and to be successful. But there is another important reason. It is that if you deny access to tertiary education to millions of people, there is such a big loss of talent. And who are the groups whose talent, whose potential is lost? First of all, everywhere, people from low-income families, people whose parents have never been to university, people from the rural area. And if we go on like that, you can see the likely results. This is a picture of a young man by the name of Ernest Rutherford. Who does know about Ernest Rutherford? He grew up in New Zealand in the late 19th century, in a rural area. His father was a poor farmer, but the kid was bright, and he wanted to study. And at that time, studying meant going to England. So he applied for a scholarship. There was only one scholarship available. He didn't get it. But then he got lucky, because the kid who had gotten it fell ill. And so Ernest Rutherford got the scholarship and went to England. And we know him today as Lord Rutherford because he's the first male scientist to ever win two Nobel Prizes. First in physics and then in chemistry. So if he hadn't get this lucky break, access to a scholarship, what a waste for mankind. The second group are females. Need I remind you that they represent half of human population? And sadly, in so many countries, they are still second-class citizens, and they don't have access to all the occupations. Again, what a waste of talent. Take this Polish student by the name of Sklodowska, Maria Sklodowska. In the late 19th century, late 1800s, she applies to study at the University of Krakow. And they tell her, "Are you crazy? You're a woman. This is not a place for you." And luckily, she found a way to leave Poland, and she went to Paris. And we know her today as Marie Curie. The story goes that she was so engrossed in her studies that she would faint because she would go hungry, she would forget to eat. Marie Curie is to this day, the only female scientist who ever won 2 Nobel Prizes. And as a result, she was the first female professor at the University of Paris, because before, women were not allowed. And then we have other minorities, all the minorities of kind, which can be ethnic minorities, language, religious, who are being denied access. In Mexico, the tertiary education enrollment rate for the indigenous population is only 7%, but for the population at large, it's 43%. In the US, it's half the percentage of the overall population. And refugees are a special group among minority groups. Last year, 2021, UNHCR had estimated that there were 26.6 million people who had to flee their country because of war. And as you can imagine, in the past 2 months, these numbers have shot up. After the brutal invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army, 6 million Ukrainian women and children were on the road and had to leave the country. Again, what a waste of talent. UNHCR estimates that only 5% of university-age refugees are able to access tertiary education, often for lack of resources, or often for also sometimes because of political opposition. In Bangladesh, for example, the government strictly prohibits any Rohingya refugee to enroll in a school or in a local university. And these people have potential. They have talent. Look at this young Nigerian refugee living in a shelter in New York City. And somebody once put a chessboard in front of him. And within a few months, he went from chess novice to chess master. And last but not least, the millions of people with disabilities throughout the world, often called the invisible minority, because so many governments do not care to provide for their special needs. So what are the reasons for the disparities? Well, it starts at the beginning. As my friend Bruce Chapman, who is the father of the income contingent loan scheme in Australia, used to say, half jokingly and half seriously, the best way to increase your chances in life is to choose your parents carefully, because that determines how much money you will have access to, and perhaps more importantly, the cultural and social capital that you will be equipped with. I'm showing here X-ray pictures of 2 3-year-old children in the US. The one on the left has lived a normal life. The one on the right has been in a situation of extreme neglect. And I'm not talking about physical abuse or malnutrition. It's a family where he or she were not exposed to intellectual stimulation. During their first years of life, children hear many words, for example, and there is a huge difference between wealthy family and low-income families or with limited education. And that affects the physical development of their brain. So what happens in the early years when children go to primary and secondary education or do not have the opportunity to go to primary and secondary education determines the pipeline of those who may arrive to higher education. And then when they reach higher education, additional barriers. First, the financial barriers, when they have to pay tuition fees, the cost of living, the cost of opportunity. And sometimes students from underserved, traditionally underrepresented groups will have lower labor market results, lower salaries. Why? Even with the same degree, because their social connection, their social capital is less. And then you have many so-called non-financial or non-monetary barriers. Poor academic preparation, lack of information, lack of motivation. If I'm a girl in many countries, I will have been told, either directly or indirectly, subtly, that studying math or physics is not for me. And I want to use a few illustrations to show the importance of these non-financial barriers, which are too often underestimated. I would like to share with you the results of an experience in India, where you have societies divided into castes. So this took place in a primary school, and two groups of children were invited to take a test. One group from the Brahmin caste, that's the highest caste, and one group from the Dalit, they used to be called the Untouchables. And when they walked into the classroom, the teacher welcomed them in the following way. A very good morning to you, beautiful and intelligent children. Please have a seat and take this very easy test. And you can see on the left the results. Of course, we all have the same intellectual abilities and capacities. So they have the same results. And then they run the same experiment with a small change. Again, two groups of randomly selected children from the Brahmin and the Dalit castes. And the experience went like this. They came into the classroom and the teacher welcomed them in the following way. Good morning, you beautiful and intelligent Brahmin children. Please come and sit in the front. You, the Dalit children, you just sit in the back. That was the only difference. But look at the results. As soon as they were reminded of their position in society, loss of self-respect, self-esteem, significantly lower results. The second point is about meritocracy. So many countries rely on sophisticated tests or exams, competitive exams, to give a chance to everyone, right? I don't discriminate. You're a girl, you're a boy, you're tall, you're short, you're rich, you're poor. It's the same exam. You get your chance, right? But we know that in reality, it is not fair. It is socially biased very often. And I think that this cartoon summarizes very well what happens in many countries. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please, climb that tree. What happens in reality? Sorry to pick on your country, Renato. University of Sao Paulo is the most prestigious university in Brazil, and one, if not the most prestigious in the whole of Latin America. It's a public university. Studying there is free of charge. Who are the candidates? 86% come from public schools. And only a tiny 14% come from private schools. These are the daughters and sons of the elite families, the wealthy families. They pay a lot of money to go to these private schools, where they are better prepared. And look at the results at the end of the exam. Supposedly fair and meritocratic, only 30% of those admitted get into the university. 70% come from the private high schools. And ironically, they will not have to pay anything. So in a way, the poor segments of society are subsidizing the studies for the rich students. And then there is this element of motivation. There have been studies in the UK that found out that students who had high marks on the A-level exam at the end of high school would not consider going to elite universities that they would be entitled to apply for. Why? Because at home, maybe the parents had never been to university, they were working class parents, and it never occurred to them, nobody advised them, encouraged them to think that they could go to Oxford or Cambridge. And so there is the story of this student who every day would ride the bus to go to a college of further education, a TVET kind of institution. That's what he aspired to. And ironically, every day he would drive in front of Imperial College, the best engineering school in the UK. So what can be done about it? Because of the complexity of these mechanisms, we need a combination of many types of measures. Financial and non-financial. 3 years ago, I was invited by the Lumina Foundation to do a survey of national equity policies. I was able to reach 71 countries. And I found that, of course, every government pays lip service to equity. Nobody is going to tell you, I don't care about equity. But the number of countries that actually are committed, have a clear vision, clear targets, a strategic plan to implement the measures proposed, they are very few. Those who are really committed, how do they deal with it? So on the financial side, many countries on this planet offer free higher education. That's going to take care of the problem. And if you are if you're lucky enough to be born in Norway or in Sweden, yes, these governments have enough resources to offer free, good quality tertiary education. But in many countries, we don't offer good quality. And that explains why many students, those who can afford it, go to private institutions. But in developing world and also some high-income countries do not finance their universities sufficiently to offer a great higher education experience. And then you have at the institutional level, we've seen much progress. Many universities or colleges take the initiative to offer additional financial support, academic help, try to identify at-risk students to to support them with psychological support, and that has been very important during and after towards the end, hopefully, of the pandemic. And some countries have also made efforts to address the needs of some of their minority groups. So in some countries, for indigenous people, for example, we find universities or colleges that have been designed and set up with these communities, and in fact are run by these communities. New Zealand or Mexico are good examples in that respect. We are blessed to have today with us, a representative from Gallaudet University in the US, in Washington, D.C., which is, to my knowledge, the only university catering for and managed by deaf people. And I encourage you to attend the President Dr. Cordano's presentation tomorrow afternoon, I think at the same time, but in a different room. If I were to conclude, I don't know if I can be optimistic or pessimistic about progress. I would say that too little has been done so far. And unfortunately, the observation made by the British historian Richard Tawney almost 100 years ago is still valid today. He defined equality of opportunity as the impertinent courtesy of an invitation offered to unwelcome guests, in the certainty that circumstances will prevent them from accepting. You may be aware of Nelson Mandela's famous quote saying that education is the best weapon to fight injustice. And I hope that together, as a tertiary education community, we work hard to ensure more access and success for the millions of young people who have been left behind. Because I believe that this is our only hope to overcome violence, intolerance, and the ignorance of the millions of people all over our planet who today seem to have surrendered their free will to fake news and conspiracy theories.
You may wish to take a few questions,
Yeah,
probably. Yes. Probably you might wish to address some questions to Dr. Salmi, please. We have a few minutes to do.
Hi, hola. Jamil, bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. La verdad es que fue...
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very clear. I'd like to ask the following question. The accompanying, because in Chile we have an experience not only of access, but the follow-up and monitoring of young people who come from less well-to-do backgrounds. That is key. So it's not just access, but also accompanying schools where traditionally people do not go to universities, and also the families, and how to ensure social upward mobility. So it's not just making access easy, because there are countries in Latin America where there is relatively free access, Argentina, the same in Sao Paulo, but the access, but often the policies do not accompany them. So how do you guarantee a follow-up and taking them by the hand, if you like, and helping them when they're actually at university?
Okay, very briefly, I'm going to summarize. The question is about two aspects. Is what kind of supporting measures to ensure that students do not only have access to tertiary education, but that they will stay on and be able to graduate. The issue of retention. And as our colleague from Chile tried to explain, that in many cases you have students, universities are able to attract through different ways students from traditionally underrepresented groups, but then they drop out. And the proportion is, and if we talk about loss of talent, that's also huge. In some Latin American countries, it can reach 40 or 50% of the students who enter. But even in richer countries, in France, for example, it's the same thing. And that's the irony. So I've been criticizing selective entry requirements and mechanisms, but some countries say, okay, we're going to be democratic, so we're going to open to anyone who graduates from high school. And then they are left out. Sometimes you have professors, maybe it's not happening in your country, but I've seen very often professors who take pride in failing the students, in maintaining their high standards. And this is described as the failure of the student, not the failure of the system. And I ask you, would you take a plane across the ocean that advertises that only 50% of the flights get to their destination? Nobody would do that. And yet, so many institutions behave like that. If 50% or 40% or even 30% of your students do not reach their destination, do not graduate, whose fault is it? Sure, you will have one or two who are maybe lazy or whatever, but the big majority is just they were not prepared, they were not motivated, maybe the pedagogy is horrible, etc., etc. So you are right, Carla, in asking this question. There's so much to do, and there are good experience to, and we'll have a panel on Friday, and we'll hear from Chile, we'll hear from Brazil, how getting students to enter was just half of the battle. And keeping them motivated, supported financially, psychologically, etc., is equally important. And the question raised also this issue of linkages between universities and high school. And yes, all these outreach programs, bridge programs, are equally important. There are schools, some universities in Germany reach out to kindergarten to start motivating girls, to explain to them that it's okay to dream to become an engineer. It should be seen only as a male profession. We'll have a panel also on Friday morning. On one panel I will be moderating. We'll have a young woman from Tanzania that set up an NGO to help students, female students, dream and then achieve their dream to study any field that they could. So, long answer to your question, but yes, these dimensions are very important. Yeah, I think Bobby and then back.
Okay. So first, I just wanted to say thank you. This was a great presentation, and I just enjoyed listening to you and all that you had to share. And I loved the cartoon that you had shown of the test needing to be fair for all of the different animals, and that everybody needs to take the same test. I think that there's humor that's in that, which is wonderful. And also for the people in the room, I think, what are one or two of the practices and policies that you've seen in various countries that are doing the best equity work that you would say will have the greatest impact in terms of the equity and having access to opportunities? So what should we hold in our thinking that's important for us to take away that you have to share?
I think there are three important elements. One is awareness. Awareness that things are not fair. Awareness of which groups in society are being left behind or sometimes actively discriminated against. So there are countries in the world, Germany, France, for example, where because it's a democratic society, there is this assumption that we don't need to worry about equality. We have a meritocratic system, not to worry. So it's illegal, for example, to ask somebody about their ethnic background, about their religion, as if it didn't matter. At the same time, there were some studies recently. They sent around CVs of job applicants. So in France, if your name is Jean Dupont, you will be accepted. If you have the same type of degree, the same academic itinerary, but if your name is Amadou or Mohammed, you will be rejected. Or if it's a male applicant, the probability of being accepted will be higher than a female applicant. So the first dimension is awareness and identifying those who are left behind. The second is to put in place comprehensive measures. It's not just one dimension. And we don't think always, we've already talked about financial motivation, academic support, psychological help, etc. If the president of Gallaudet University allows me to speak on her behalf, when I watched her presentation a few months back, and that's why I invited her to join this conference, and I'm so grateful that you accepted UNESCO's invitation. She explained to us that in the US, there are legal requirements for institutions to provide, for example, a deaf student with a sign language interpreter, to make sure that the academic experience will be fulfilled. But what about the rest of the life of a student? Because being a student is not only preparing for the exam. There is also social interaction with your peers, cultural activities, sports, etc. But there was no requirement that the student would be supported by a sign language interpreter. So these are complex situations, and we really need to listen to the voice of the students, of those who are directly concerned, to shape our policies. And the last point is, many universities do lots of things, which on paper sound very nice, but do they work? So it's important also to monitor and to evaluate what works and what doesn't work, and to also disseminate and share this experience so that others can. I like to talk about the equity virus. When something nice happens in one place and it gets, and if you allow me 1 minute, a true story from Chile. I'll take you back 100 years ago. 1921. The first female medical doctor graduates from the University of Chile. At that time, they had visiting professor from Germany. The professor is so impressed by the talent of that young scholar that he said, "Would you like to come and do a specialization at Humboldt University?" Sure. So when he travels back to Germany, he wants to register, and I say, "Are you crazy?" And he said, "Oh, I forgot. At that time, women were not allowed to study medical education in Germany." So he negotiates, and they say, "Okay, we're going to make an exception for her because she's from Chile." You're right. So she comes, and I believe they did what we see in some countries still today. They put like a separation in the classroom, so man here, female student here. But then some German women heard about this case, and they got very angry. They said, "What about us?" And this is how German women were allowed to study medical education. So sometimes a good practice in one department, one faculty, will spread to the entire university, or one university to the rest of the country, and from one country to the end. That's what I call the equity virus, much nicer than the COVID virus. I think we had the last question in the back.
Thank you, Jamil, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Ilige van Tland. I'm the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. What I'm interested in is that part on education and the valorization of education in that word, higher education. Do you see good examples of where it is actually valorized to the point where we will be able to make a difference? Because what I hear from the part of the presentation that I could attend, unfortunately I came a bit late, is that education is not taken sufficiently seriously. If you have an institution where you're allowed to fail 50% of the students, it means that you don't care about education. You care about transmitting knowledge, but not about education. And do you see some examples of where that is changing and opportunities for an association like the IAU to maybe pick that up and scale it up in order for it to change for real?
A few years back, I did some work with a Chilean university, which was one of the, which I will not name here, one of the top engineering-oriented Chilean university. It was set up, they were inspired by the German model when they started 40 or 50 years ago. Very successful, but the years have passed, so they were now preparing a new strategic plan. And I had the opportunity to talk to many people. And I realized that for one big challenge they had is that girls, women, did not feel welcome in that university. And ironically, one of their graduates became very famous in Chile because she's an entrepreneur. But university didn't really take credit for that because she was a girl, right? And so why didn't she, I mean, they had the grades to enter university, they were doing fine, but the mindset of the teachers was such that they were made to feel that, what are you doing here? They were not welcome. You know, that's why I call my presentation To Belong or Not to Belong, because there are all these elements, I haven't had time to include them as well, but they're equally important, of the institutional culture. It's not just, you know, you have many talented students from low-income families that make it into the Harvard of these worlds or the Oxford, but some of them, they don't feel that they belong because there is this invisible institutional culture that is propagated by the other students who come from rich families or by the teachers themselves who speak this very, you know, English language, especially in England, can be very socially biased and show what group in society you come from, etc. So all these aspects of culture make them not welcome. And then there is this notion, very few think about in terms of added value. You know, what does the institution, you know, it's very good, very easy for Harvard to be the best university in the world because they are so rich, you know, an endowment of $40 billion, that's more than the GDP of 100 countries in the world, the 100 poorest countries. They can recruit the best professors and they can select the best students. When people ask me what's the best higher education system in the world, I sometimes say, well, the US is not a bad system, but not because of these fancy Ivy schools, because of the community colleges, because they take a very diverse population and they try to add value. They take kids who are not motivated, who are not culturally or academically prepared, and they try to add value. And then also the culture of the interaction between professor and students. Most universities today, I think, are still professor-centered universities. So a professor decides what they teach, how they teach. Usually they teach very poorly, because we assume that because I have a PhD, I'm a great teacher. I may have a great mind with lots of knowledge, but if I'm unable to share that knowledge with my students, to motivate them, to make the content and the exciting, then I think I'm failing as a professor. And that's why you have 40% dropout rates. In the previous session, we talked about something similar, and I was mentioning the statistic that in the US, the proportion of women studying engineering is 25%, right? There is an institution called All-In College of Engineering. It's not a prestigious research university, but it's a great school of engineering with a interdisciplinary curriculum with entrepreneurship and human values. It's teamwork, team-based, and it's solution-based pedagogy. It's a very, if you visit that place, it's the most exciting institution I've ever visited. And they have 50% of women. Not because they have a quota, not because they give special scholarships to these women, just because it's so attractive. And then women say, oh, studying engineering is not boring, it's so all these dimensions of turning around the mindset and making these institutions student-centered. And another dimension that is missing, we've been talking about high school graduates, but today, in the 21st century, we should be talking about lifelong learning. And as we consider a more diverse student population, what are these universities doing to help adults? So either to give them a second opportunity or to help them update their training or change career. This is so important. So this is one of the changes in mindset that we need to do.
So thank you very much again, once again.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you. So.